So now I'm going to talk a little bit about subsistence, demography, and technology among modern foragers. We're going to take a look particularly on the Eskimo up in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. I'll talk a little bit about what I prefer to call them and what I prefer you call them in a little bit. Also, the Shoshone, the Jukwasi, who I will refer to as the Kung, and the Arente in Australia, and then the Mabudi in Central Africa, and Semang. It's first worthwhile to note that hunter-gatherers are mostly mobile, and they live this way for food, essentially. Seasonally, different foods grow in different areas, so when they're foraging for foods, they need to go where those foods are currently growing. Frequently animals migrate, move around from season to season, so they also need to follow the animals so they can hunt. Some hunter-gatherers live in different groups depending on the seasons. So in times of relative abundance, they'll live in slightly larger groups, extended family groups, whereas in times of less abundance, they will live in smaller groups. Sometimes the smallest is just the nuclear family, so parents and children. This allows them to minimize labor while providing resources. So when you have abundance, you can have more people, which makes it easier to gather or hunt food. But because there's abundance, you can still feed that many people. However, in times of less abundance, you don't want too many people or you won't be able to feed them all. And this requires intimate knowledge of environments. You need to know when that abundance is going to happen and when you need to split up. You also can't just depend on one particular person to know everything, or different people to be responsible for knowing different things. Everyone needs to know all of the information, so when you break into smaller groups, you can still function. Hunter-gathering societies are now restricted to what we call marginal environments. These are environments that are, relatively harder to subsist in. Once upon a time, all humans lived in hunter-gathering societies. And over time, different types of societies have developed in certain areas. As a result, the few foraging societies that had adapted to these marginal or, not necessarily the most desirable regions were able to exist in relative isolation. No one really wanted those areas. No larger scale societies that could have, essentially just destroyed these cultures. None of those societies wanted these regions, so they were left alone for the most part. Desert foragers, and something wonky has happened with the slide, but desert foragers, the examples that we'll be talking about are the Jukwasi or the Kung in southern Africa, the Shoshone and the Great Basin region of North America, and the Arente in Australia. The Kung or the Jukwasi San, there are around 7,000 people. They don't all live together. They live in smaller bands. But total there are about 7,000 Kung. The diet is 70 to 80% nuts, fruits, roots, melons, and berries. So things that women are responsible for gathering, and often children would help as well. And then 20 to 30% of their diet comes from meat, and that is what men are responsible for hunting for. Adults spend 2 to 3 days per week acquiring food, and the rest of the time they participate in ritual or leisure activities. The Great Basin Shoshone, men hunt and trap game, Women collected seeds, insects, and vegetation, and both collected wild pinyon nuts, which is important later on when we talk about economy. And that'll come back, the pinyon nuts. We don't really have information on how much time they spent doing these things because they don't live in this exact way anymore. And then the Oriente in Australia, women and children gathered seeds, root snails, insects, reptiles, burrowing rodents, and bird and reptile eggs, while men hunted larger game, so kangaroo, wallaby, and emu. And you'll notice that hunting and gathering, the definition changes depending on what society it is. So the definition of gathering what things can be gathered changes from society to society, and that is partially because of the environment and what food sources are available in certain areas. And the Oriente in Australia, they worked about 4 hours a day per person acquiring food. So, relatively similar to the Kung, maybe a little bit more. Well, actually, a bit more, yes, to acquire the food. And that is, again, that depends on the environment where they live. Tropical rainforest foragers like the Mabudi and the Semang. The Mabudi in Central Africa, they've lived in the rainforest for at least 5,000 years, so quite some time. Relatively unbothered by outside people until, relatively recently. The division of labor is different among the Mabudi. So instead of women gathering and men hunting, separately, they have what is called a collaborative hunt. And in this situation, women and children will essentially go into the forest and herd game towards the men who are lined up to shoot and kill the game for eating. So it's collaborative as opposed to working separately, doing different things. And then the Semang in the Malaysian and Thai peninsula have more of a what we call a traditional system. They rely primarily on foods gathered by females, which is very common throughout many hunter-gathering, or if not most, I would say most hunter-gathering societies rely primarily on food gathered by women and secondarily on fish and small game hunted by men. An exception to this rule are people that lived in the Arctic regions. So we have the Inuit, the Inuit, the Yupik, and the Aleut, and all of their subgroups can be referred to under the broad term Eskimo. However, I prefer to, when I can, talk about the group specifically. We'll be talking mostly about the Inuit today. So the Inuit reside in Canada, the north part of Alaska, where one of the groups there is called the Inupiat, and in Greenland. And then the Yupik reside in Siberia and not quite as north Alaska. And then the Aleut are in the Aleutian Islands, which are islands that sort of form an archipelago off the coast of Alaska. I wish I had a map to show you, but you can look that up relatively easily. The Inuit, the earliest current archaeological evidence we have for the Inuit was from 2500 BCE, so that's about 4,500 years ago. Depending on access, they hunt sea mammals or land animals. So the Inuit live in quite a broad range of areas, all across northern Alaska through to Canada and over into Greenland. So when they live more inland, they hunt land animals, and when they live on the coast, they hunt sea mammals. Vegetation was very prized because of its rarity. Summer is quite short that north, so they had a limited time to gather. They ate primarily meat because of this, and they satisfied basic requirements of carbs, protein, and vitamins from berries, green roots, fish, and fish oil. Very important. They had a different division of labor, which we'll also see affecting their economy later when we talk about that. This was caused by a lack of vegetation. So in the summer, men and women gathered larvae, caribou flies, maggots, and deer droppings that contain vegetation. And in the winter, in any time that wasn't the summer, essentially, they relied on the men hunting. And in that time, they did for land animals, at least, they would scrape out their stomachs, which would have some vegetation that the people would then process and eat. And we'll come back to this when we talk about, political stratification, social stratification, economy. This will impact differences in those things as well as just subsistence. Foraging demographics, they had limited population size. For one, because they're mobile and you just need to have fewer people. It's much easier to move around a lot with less people. They also depend on natural resources of food. So those resources, wax and wane with seasons, so they have to move around to get those resources. The areas where they live usually have low carrying capacity. So the soils aren't necessarily quite as fertile, and they only depend on human labor, so there's, relatively fewer people can live in these areas. Too many people cause shortages of resources, and too few people cause ineffective foraging strategies. So the Mabudi in Central Africa, if they don't have enough people, they can't effectively collaboratively hunt. Means of limiting population growth. Fissioning, that's when the group will split into two or more smaller groups and move away from the original group. This helps explain worldwide human expansion. It's one of the theories of why humans, Homo sapiens, expanded. Those societies got too large, they fissioned, they moved away. It's more limited in modern times because they don't have as much area to spread out. So conflict or fusion, two groups forming one, are more likely. There's also infanticide. This is only done if a child was unlikely to survive in these societies. So it generally appears to be an individual decision. It would happen if maybe the mother had twins. She wouldn't have enough caloric intake herself to nurse both children, so she would have to, the stronger one would survive. It's usually when it's a, one or none situation. And then there's geronticide, and geronticide is the opposite of infanticide. It's when elders are killed. Usually they were abandoned rather than killed, with hopes to return to them when there was more plenty. So it happened in times of famine. It's only practiced among some groups of Inuit, despite that, iceberg floating out with your grandparents on it. That didn't really happen, and that doesn't happen. Some other groups of Inuit find it abhorrent, so of course they aren't going to participate in that. There's also the case of assisted suicide. Culturally, in some Inuit groups, if elders themselves feel like they're a drain on the family or the cult or the society, they will ask someone else in their family to essentially kill them. And culturally, these people are bound to do so to honor their wishes, but obviously this isn't happening now because of legality issues of the countries that they reside in. Biological factors that limit growth are low caloric intake and high energy rate. Actually, I'm going to pause here and we'll pick it up in the next part.